Hello and welcome to the Pacifica Experience Day. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Okay, let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Pacifica Experience Day. My name is Jessica Rubenstein and I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions Coordination here at Pacifica Graduate Institute. We will be first given a welcome by Dr. Joseph Cambray, the President and CEO of Pacifica Graduate Institute, followed by Peter Roysevich, who is the Provost.
Welcome, everyone. It's really a delight to have you here virtually for this Pacifica Experience Day. We're looking at both enrollment in the spring for our two hybrid programs and for the fall for the full slate of our programs. But what a time we're in between now and the spring, and then between the spring and the fall. It's unlike any other time in our history that we're going through. We already are in the midst of a pandemic, a contested presidential election, the reflections on systemic racism. The country is just, the entire globe is just buzzing with all of this. It's a time of enormous uncertainty and doubt and concern. It evokes the apocalyptic imagination, and I'm going to say a few words about that. I'm going to start here with a quote from one of our founding guiding lights for the institution, C.G. Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist analyst, who wrote about this kind of experience more than a century ago. And what you can see here, he said, "What will the future bring? From time immemorial, this question has occupied men's minds, and women's, obviously, though not always to the same degree. It is chiefly in times of physical, emotional, economic, and spiritual distress that men's eyes turn with anxious hope towards the future, and when anticipations, utopias, and apocalyptic visions multiply." Folks, that's where we're at. And that's something very fundamental for Pacifica to help us understand. The apocalyptic imagination goes back into the ancient world. The term comes from the ancient Greek, where it means great revelation. And usually it's thought about in terms of an end of the world. Now, I don't think that we're looking at, in quote, a literal end of the world, but we're looking at the end of something, the end of a particular era. Just all of us being online is a first introduction to that kind of consideration. I don't think we're going to go back to the old normal. There's going to be a new normal in which we incorporate all of this. And certainly for the last 8-9 months, Pacifica has been working vociferously every day, trying to absorb as much as we can about how to work online more effectively, to really be able to deliver remotely synchronous and asynchronous, and to enhance the campus experiences. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of those. But first, in this apocalyptic moment, we're going through this crisis of a generation and maybe of a lifetime. I want to just draw one thing from the speech of Joe Biden on November 7th. It's effectively his acceptance speech. And I was very struck with the resonance of this particular statement with Pacifica's own mission and goals. And that's why I want to put it up. Biden says, "I believe it's this. Americans have called upon us to marshal the forces of decency and the forces of fairness, to marshal the forces of science and the forces of hope in the great battle of our time, the battle to control the virus, the battle to build prosperity, the battle to secure your family's health care, the battle to achieve racial justice and root out systemic racism in this country, and the battle to save our planet by getting climate under control. The battle is to restore decency, defend democracy, and give everybody in this country a fair shot. That's all they're asking for, a fair shot. I think he's talking about himself. But Pacifica and the depth psychological perspective has more and more over the last century evolved into a systemic approach. A depth approach is a systemic approach. That is, you look holistically at everything that's going on. So when you talk about systemic racism or climate change or the pandemic, what you're really talking about are things that are systemic, and they're hard for our ordinary conscious ego minds to grasp because they're involving things that are outside of our immediate central awareness, and yet they majorly impact us. And how do we work with our own tendency to deny that? How do we work to make that a part of both our own individual psychic reality and the reality of our whole community, and in fact, our entire world? And you can see that Biden is moving in that direction. And I'm thinking this is a wonderful moment for Pacifica to join in this kind of a plea to the country, plea to the world in terms of what we're going to take on. Now, during a pandemic, all kinds of wild things happen. And I will point you to a book that just came out in June. It's called Pandemic Dreams. It's a collection of dreams about the pandemic that was done by Harvard dream researcher Deirdre Barrett. She's actually going to be here in June for a conference that we're putting on altered states and dreams and so forth. But she did an online study where she collected something like 7,000 dreams from 3,500 people, something like that. It's in there. And you can get a feeling for what the collective effect on the psyche is through this kind of lens of our unconscious mind, the way we're processing it, and the way it shows up in our dreams. And what you get out of some of that, at least to me, is that the COVID virus is really a kind of archetypal element in our world right now. It acts like a trickster. That's certainly happening. There are all kinds of odd silver linings that are happening despite all the terrible suffering and loss and distress that we're all going through and the disruption of our lives. To take it one step further, it's a virus. And what is a virus? It's almost like a biochemical machine. It's right at the edge. If you're a virologist or you're a biologist, and you look at viruses, you can actually crystallize them and put them on the shelf. They act like just an inner chemical compound in one way. But then when you put them into the environment, they act like a living organism. And they're on that edge between inanimate and animate. Well, that's something that Jungian psychologists know a lot, and depth psychologists know a lot about. That's what we call the psychoid. And that psychoid realm is right on that interface. And to be honest, many of you are probably interested in the concept of synchronicity, something I've been devoted to for the last 25 years or so. And I know our morning speaker, Professor Wood, will be talking about that. But in Jung's definition of synchronistic phenomena, the psychoid level is always activated. And that's, I think, incredibly important, because when you look at something like the pandemic, you see that it has a fundamental psychoid core to it. And how is that affecting us? I'll give you one very brief example before I wrap up my remarks. I was working with a group in another country on dreams. And in the midst of this, it came up, this was fairly early on, about what was happening to the change ecologically. This is one of the trickster pieces. The atmosphere was getting cleaner. And there was studies in the New York Times to show that during the month of February, when everybody goes home for the holiday, there's a month-long holiday in China, the air quality generally really improves because the factories shut down. But then in March, it starts to kick back up. Well, because of the lockdown that was going on in China, that curve got bent much, much lower, that the pollution in China was significantly decreased. I was telling that as a part of a narrative in a dream group that had a lot of Chinese people in it. And one of them became very emotional. And so we stopped and said, what was happening? And she said, now I understand. And so we were very curious. And she went on, she said, the other day I went outside and I felt an enormous wave of sadness and I didn't know why. And she said, now that I hear what you said, I realized it was the hue, the blueness of the sky was something I had not seen for 10 years. And I felt this tremendous wave of nostalgia when I began to remember what it used to be like. So, what a curious turn there in terms of altering consciousness, in these terrible ways where we're facing death and destruction, to also at the same time become ecologically much more aware. And the whole group was very deeply moved by this experience because we could all feel and live the oppression of what our atmosphere's been like. So these are just a few of the kind of topics that are hot here at Pacifica. We're also working, we have a new diversity, equity, and inclusion task force that's really dipping in very deeply to all aspects of life at not only Pacifica, but in our community around us. And it has faculty, staff, students, alumni, and outside community members that are a part of that. It's part of the dynamic change that we're in, that we're not only going to be changed, but we're going to be agents of change during the change. So that's what I really want to invite you to, the kind of the new Pacifica. And for those of you who are thinking about next fall, I'm really hoping by then we'll have a vaccine that will all be safe enough to finally get back into the campuses, and we will have a wonderful opening launch, a real party where we can celebrate on campus with everyone. So I look forward to meeting many of you over the course of the next year. And again, welcome to Pacifica. And now I'll turn it over to Provost Dr. Peter Rasevich. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning. My name is Peter Rasevich, and I'm the provost. And the provost is the chief academic officer of the Institute. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for having us in your homes for this experience. I want to tell you a few things about Pacifica. We perfectly know that you have many choices to satisfy your graduate school needs. And so we're very thankful that you are looking at Pacifica as a place that you may find for your educational needs. Now, Pacifica is a very special place, and Dr. Cambray gave you a little bit about that, but I want to focus on a few aspects of it. Pacifica is a engaged, intentional community. And I want to talk about that a little bit more. By engaged, we mean, we take the word from the late Middle English. That means it's a community that pledges itself to do something, right? And that engagement is related to our intention. What are we pledging ourselves to do? Well, our intention is our mission, to tend to soul in and of the world. That is to say, to be first responders to the interiority, to the internal life of people, of other species, of the earth itself. And this is part of our community. And by community at Pacifica, we understand it as the experience of belonging, that we're in community whenever we can find a place to belong. Now, right now, as the president has described, the world is a difficult place to belong in. It's hard to belong politically when we see bipartisan antagonism or hatred. It's hard for us to belong socially and culturally when we see racial injustice and systemic racism and misogyny and more. And it's hard to belong environmentally when there are ongoing fires and flash floods and rising sea temperatures and climate change and the ongoing deterioration of our earth. And at Pacifica, belonging has two meanings. When you come to Pacifica and you're a member of the community, you have membership. And by membership, we mean that you're not an outsider, you're not an outlier, you're not operating at the margins, but you enter into an association, an institution, a cohort, a kind of sangha. And so membership is part of community, but it's also understood here as ownership. To be in a community means to co-create in your cohort, co-create a vision, a culture that you learn in and that you live in. And so Pacifica's community is about belonging or longing to be, right? Longing to be. And it is not a collusion of the dependence. Our sense of community calls for us to step into a larger life, to move from the I to the we, from the personal to the communal, right? From the human to the earth itself. And so our community that you may join is based on care, on an ethic of care. And by that, we mean a voluntary commitment of the heart of a person expressed through a cohort, through a community. And this carries with it a certain responsibility, right? Care carries with it spirit or soul. When you care about something or someone or yourself, you're moved towards asking a few questions. What is my experience? What is my effect on other people and other species? What are the interrelationships between myself and others? And am I attending to those relationships? So our community of care, which carries spirit and soul, also presupposes hospitality. And it's a way of, hospitality is a way of countering patronizing relationships, exclusionary relationships between strangers. When you come to Pacifica, you will know maybe no one right away, but soon you will have the sense of hospitality, which demands something from us, that as hosts, we become decentered. We make room within our own life, within our own minds, within our own hearts, within our own perspective. We make room for other views, other perspectives, other ethnicities, other gender identifications, different sexual preferences. And by decentering ourselves and allowing other people in, we transform our understanding of ourselves as well as others, and we configure and we transform ourselves, so that the hospitality of this community is not mere tolerance, which makes no demands on us to transform ourselves. It's not merely accommodating, it's something that enlarges us. Depth psychology is the basis of the Institute. Whether you study counseling or clinical psychology, whether you're in engaged humanities and the creative life, whether you're part of community, liberation, indigenous, and eco-psychologies, you will in fact be engaged in bringing forward into the world the interior states of soul. This is the psychoid elements that Dr. Cambray spoke about. And so you'll bring forth interiority through dreams, through myths, through the study of alchemy and astrology, through art and art making, and through synchronicities. And you'll be listening to Professor Wood speak on that very shortly. So as we understand community, we tend to soul, which we understand is not only the capacity for greater self-awareness, but it's your self-awareness in conjunction with an objective sense of the inner qualities of the outer world. So I want to just end, if I may, by pointing out what we mean by that, how transformation comes from depth psychology, which tends to the soul in and of the world. And soul extends into the physical world as much as within ourselves. It's a line from Walt Whitman. There was a child went forth every day, and the first object he looked upon, that object he became, and that object became part of him. There's also a phrase from the Zulu peoples, Umuntu Ngumuntu Nagabantu, which translates as a person is a person through other persons. And finally, a line from Plotinus, no eye ever saw the sun without becoming sun-like, nor a soul see beauty without becoming beautiful. So I hope you'll consider coming to Pacifica Graduate Institute and choose it as your learning community, wherein you will undergo the transformation of your mind, body, and spirit. And insofar as you use that transformation as a gift to yourself, and insofar as you see that gift as a capacity to see the good and the true and the beautiful in other people, in other ethnicities, in other species, then you may become very much the difference in the world. Thank you for your time today, and I do thank you for considering Pacifica Graduate Institute.
Thank you to, excuse me, thank you to you both for our welcome. So as an overview of the day, we will have a featured presentation followed by 2 program breakout sessions. And finally, we'll close the day with a student services panel. There is a free application link on the landing page, so you can use that link to apply to Pacifica Graduate Institute for free because you paid the entrance fee for this event. And I also wanted to let you know that we will be recording this experience day. So you will receive an email to your email address that you signed up for this event in the next week with the recordings. And the breakout sessions will be recorded as well. So if you would not like to be shown in the recordings, please keep your video and microphone on mute. On the landing page for the day, we also have information for our admissions advisors. Please feel free to contact them with any questions about applying to Pacifica. You can also email admissions@pacifica.edu with general questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our featured presenter and our panelists. We will have a featured presentation from Dr. Mary Wood.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
And the topic is Moments of Meaning, How Synchronicity and Chance Reveal Our Destinies. And I'd also like to introduce our panelists who are Pacifica alumni and members of the Pacifica community.
Yeah, could you all turn on your camera? Hi, Dylan. Hi, Tara, Devin, Gilmar.
So if each of you could please just introduce yourself and say a little bit about yourself, and then we will get into our featured presentation.
How about Gilmar first? I see your mic is on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gilmar Coe. I have been going to Pacifica now for 5 years, almost 5 years straight. I'm at the very tail end of completing the DJA program, which is the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program. And before that, I did 2 years in the Engaged Humanities and the Creative Life program.
Dylan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dylan Hoffman. I graduated in 2016 from the Jungian and Archetypal Studies Ph.D. program, and I currently teach in that same program, teaching the course on archetypes in the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program. Welcome again.
And Dylan also just completed co-teaching a class for Engaged Humanities on Jung individuation and the symbolic life. Thanks, Dylan. And Tara, welcome.
Thank you. So my name is Tara Gilmar, and I'm a graduate of both the Master's in Counseling program, and I'm in my dissertation stage in the Integrated Therapies and Healing Practices, one of the depth psychology PhDs. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and clinically I tend to work with attachment, somatic, relational, and Jungian. I was lucky enough to have a psychoanalyst for a supervisor and to do an internship with a Jungian analyst doing administering work.
Wonderful, great. Thank you for being here, Tara. And Devin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mary. Good to be here. My name is Devin Daimler, and I completed my PhD in the Mythological Studies program in 2019, and it was an absolutely wonderful experience. I am currently working as curator at Opus Archives and Research Center on campuses of Pacifica. So this is where we have the collections of Joseph Campbell, James Hillman, Marion Woodman, and several others who are very important to the field, and those are open for research. So I feel very lucky for that. And I'm also scholar in residence at a kindred institution in LA called the Philosophical Research Society.
Well, thanks, Devin. Thanks for being with us today. So Jessica, I think I'll just go ahead and take it away, as we are wanting to be very cognizant of our time today.
Yes, thank you so much. And just one more note, you will get a chance to ask some questions to our panelists afterward. Mary will give her feature presentation, and then around 10:45, the alumni and students will join us again for a panel, and you are welcome to ask questions in the Q&A box to them later. Great, let's get started.
Thanks, Jessica. So I'm going to share my screen here with all of you. There we go. What I'd like to do today is give you all a bit of a glimpse into what a typical classroom session might look like. Even though we're not able to be together on those gorgeous campuses, we're able to do quite a lot with Zoom and other technologies. So regardless of what program you might be looking at, these classroom sessions always include some lively discussion. So you've just met our panelists, and they'll be standing by at the end. We've composed a kickoff question for them, and then we'd be very happy to take your questions about either the subject matter or their personal experiences at Pacifica or with Synchronicity. So Synchronicity, what is it? C.G. Jung, the Swiss psychologist and analyst, called it an acausal connecting principle, a very short statement, but one that needs a bit of unpacking. So let's look at those words. Acausal. Initially, one might think that's the opposite of causal, and that's a good place to start. Causality or causal connectivity has long been the dominant view in the West regarding how things come to be, come together, and come to exist. For example, phenomenon A was caused by phenomenon B, B was caused by C, and those can be traced back into time. We can all think about how we got here this morning, sitting in front of our computers. We can begin to trace those steps back. We can trace back how our computers came to be sitting in front of us. So synchronicity does not deny causality, but it suggests that there's something else that may be going on. So up until the early 20th century, the Western scientific tradition had been based on the view that natural laws were governed exclusively by causality. And Jung, while not denying the existence of causality, claimed that it was, quote, only statistically valid and only relatively true. So acausality, which is less familiar to us in the West, implies that there are other forces at play, forces that we might call chance or accident, and that these are just as valid as causality. So connecting principle, what did Jung mean by this? Well, it's a device or phenomenon that links events together. In the case of synchronicity, what we're looking at is a connecting principle. Can't be accounted for by a chain of events that can be followed. The thing that does the linking is meaning. Let me move here to my next slide. So meaning was critical for Jung. It was at the very foundation of his work. And here you see this iconic quote from his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, about the importance of meaning. He had a deep curiosity regarding the possibility of meaning occurring in chance or random events, and wondered whether that meaning might be present even if we weren't conscious of it. So the images in this slide are pulled together to illustrate one of the most well-known stories about synchronicity in Jung's life. He was working with one of his female analysants, one of his patients, and she had had a dream featuring a scarab. It had a very Egyptian sort of feeling tone to it. And they were at a point in the analysis where she was really stuck. They were in an intractable place. And as she was discussing this dream and the symbol of the scarab to him, he heard something scratching at the window, perhaps that same window that's right behind him in this image. And that annoyance caused him to get up and go to the window. And what he discovered there was a very large beetle, something that, a creature that was unusual for his region, something that was unusual to see at that time of year. So he opened the window, astonished as he was, grabbed the beetle and placed it into her hand. And she too, in her astonishment and wonder, realized that this sort of connection between the psychical and the physical was something absolutely stunning. And it was a turning point for her. It was something that opened up new levels of understanding about herself, her connection to her world, and to her soul. So here's a quote by Lillian Frey Rohn from her book From Freud to Jung, connecting this concept of meaning to synchronicity. Synchronistic phenomena can be understood by the human mind only when the idea of causal determinism has been supplemented. Notice that she doesn't say supplanted, supplemented by the equally universal concept of a connection through equivalence or meaning. This appeared to Jung to be another dimension, one transcending the causal connection and suggesting an acausal orderedness. So it's a way of thinking that doesn't separate the physical world from interior psychic events. One thing to keep in mind, though, however, is that Jung did not suggest that thinking about something, having an obsession or a predisposition or having something stirring in your psyche, that you actually made that thing happen in the material world. That is not the aim of synchronicity. And we will kind of flesh that out a little bit more as we keep going. So let me move to our next slide here. So I'd like to tell you another story about synchronicity in Jung's life. This one actually happened to him. He would take frequent walks around the lake close to his home. And during one of his walks, he came across a snake that had swallowed a fish. The two of them had engaged in a battle, a life or death battle, and both ended up dead. This would have been a stunning sight for anyone to come across, but particularly for Jung, because he had for some time been working on the antagonism between Christianity and alchemy, or non-Christian ways of knowing spiritual traditions. And the fact that he saw these two creatures lying dead together in this way by the side of the lake struck him, and it gave him the symbol that he needed to formulate his thoughts on this relationship between Christianity and alchemy. It was so moving to him that he carved this, what's called a snake stone, that still stands next to his home near Zurich. What he carved on the stone is this: because it devoured a fish too large, the snake suffocated. In this way, both perished simultaneously, to testify that the Christian Mass and the alchemical work are the same and not the same. Namely, their death was an event coinciding and corresponding with my own thoughts. In memory of this event, I, C.G. Jung, placed the stone in the year 1933. So his growing awareness of synchronicity helped him to realize just how much these sorts of symbols had meant to him, both archetypally and also representing his own struggle to find a way to integrate the alchemical, sort of more broadly the ancient wisdoms that had been pushed aside, and the Catholic or overall Christian sacraments and symbols. One of the key factors that influenced Jung's conception of synchronicity was his curiosity about non-Western traditions, particularly Taoist thought. Around 1928, he'd been working for over a dozen years on his Liber Novus, or his Red Book. Some of you may be familiar with that iconic, amazing text. At that time, he was given a copy by chance, a synchronous event, of a book called The Secret of the Golden Flower, translated by his good friend, the sinologist Richard Wilhelm. And the receipt of this book allowed Jung to begin to see layers and layers of cross-cultural parallels between his own thinking about the union of the physical and the spiritual, and about the interconnection of the individual to the collective. So at that time, the synchronous event offered him a threshold to put down the Red Book and devote more of his time to these cross-cultural studies, and particularly to a deeper dive into medieval alchemical texts. So not long after he received and knew, just devoted himself to learning about Chinese alchemical thought and the acausal principles embedded in that, he began to use the word synchronicity in his talks. And here's one of his statements about that, an early statement that he gave during a seminar on dream analysis. Quote, "The East bases much of its science on this irregularity," meaning the acausal principle, "and considers coincidences as the reliable basis of the world rather than causality. Synchronism is the prejudice of the East. Causality is the modern prejudice of the West. The more we busy ourselves with dreams, the more we shall see such coincidences, chances. Remember that the oldest scientific book, the I Ching, is about the possible chances of life." And I'll mention a little bit more about the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching in just a moment. So Dr. Cambray just a moment ago mentioned something about the psychoid. And this was an area that Jung explored with the young physicist Wolfgang Pauli. So it wasn't only his scholarship and curiosity about non-Western ways of thinking about reality and causality, but it was also his curiosity through the doorway of physics. So let's think for a moment now about a sort of working definition of synchronicity based on what I've offered so far. One of Jung's most memorable ways of describing it, other than an acausal connecting principle, is that synchronicity is a falling together in time, a kind of simultaneity. And according to Dr. Cambray, who you just met a few moments ago, in his book on synchronicity, he calls it an act of creation in time, which I think is extremely clear and very memorable. So what Jung was working on was a theory that the universe is permeated with psyche, just as it is with space, time, and matter. and that the synchronicities provide us with traces of an original, undifferentiated state. What synchronicity is not, again, it's not a principle of magical agency where these outer occurrences, as with the example of the beetle in Jung's office, where they are somehow caused or conjured by the inward simultaneous psychic processes happening. It is not that, but it's closer to a revelation of the interconnectedness of the universe, where an inner state meets in an intersection of sorts, an outer occurrence in a subjective, meaningful way, such that psyche and matter appear woven together. When we have synchronicities, they can be accompanied by feelings, a feeling quality of meeting the numinous, perhaps. We catch glimpses of a unity that is deeper than anything that we can experience in our day-to-day lives. We're taken aback by their strangeness. Jung would use the word uncanny to describe synchronicities. We're moved, we can be moved with awe, with wonder, fear, foreboding even, or a sense of grace, of holiness, of fate, or a combination of any of these. And the startling nature of a synchronicity can expand our worldviews, although like dreams, the actual synchronicity, the moment of synchronicity can tend to fade quite quickly from consciousness. It's important when an important synchronicity makes itself known to us, that we try to remember it, that we try to memorialize it. We don't have to carve it in stone, but there are many, many ways to deepen a synchronistic event. So turning our attention to synchronicity and vocation, the focus of our talk here, how do synchronicities relate to vocation? This wonderful passage from the analyst Russell Lockhart's book, Psyche Speaks, explains that so beautifully, that it's not so much just one synchronicity. If we look back over our lives, we can start to see a thread of synchronistic events, chance occurrences, chance meetings, stumbling across something that that would change your life or someone. We can see these over a matter of months or years. Synchronicities can again be threshold experiences. We oftentimes find ourselves, all of us, betwixt and between, stuck in what depth psychology likes to call a liminal space. I think we're all in something like that right now with the pandemic and this very painful waiting with the election process here in our country. So the arresting quality of a synchronistic experience has the potential to help us focus during these times, focus our attention on who we are, our place in the cosmos, our relationship to others, to our community, to psyche, and what else is yearning to be expressed. Thinking back to what our provost, Dr. Roysevich, said just a few moments ago, yearnings are the stirrings in the psyche that sometimes meet outer occurrences, events, something that you see, a book that you pick up, a film, an overheard conversation. Those are the things that we need to pay attention to. Those are the signs, the oracles that can help us determine where we are in our path and what is being asked of us. What is our mission? What is our duty, our destiny? And synchronicities are not all personal, even though there's the meaningfulness is highly subjective. Just very quickly, I wanted to point out a couple of stories. One that is part of Joseph Campbell's, Joseph Cambray's book on synchronicity, and that's A Conquest of the New World, where the psychic idea of the return of Quetzalcoatl played a part in the ease that Hernan Cortez and his very small army had with subduing this much larger Aztec empire. So those sorts, there are synchronistic events that move entire cultures. And an additional thought is that synchronicity is not necessarily quote unquote good. There's not a necessary moral value in it. It has a neutrality to it and a complexity that is important to keep in mind. You see Abraham Lincoln here. He had an interesting story with the synchronicity, with finding, well, not finding, but through his kindness, when he was the owner of a small general store, prior to ever studying law, he bought a barrel full of possessions from a gentleman that was traveling west, trying to sell a little bit of what he had along the way in order to get out to the west. And Lincoln kept this barrel in his store for some time. And at one point he opened it to see what was in it. A jumble of papers, and at the bottom, almost a complete edition of Blackstone's commentaries, which were early law books. And he was able to self-study, to become a lawyer. Meeting that individual, having the kindness to buy that barrel, having the occurrence to actually open it, allowed him to completely change his life and change the lives of many millions of people beyond that. So I'm running just a tiny bit over. Let me go to one other dimension that has something to do with vocation as well. And that's the connection between synchronicity and divination. And the same factor that we're talking about, that meaningfulness, is apparent in casting of the I Ching, which Jung did often. It's also apparent in working with astrology, with tarot. You know, if any of you have practiced any of these oracular methods of getting through a difficult problem, finding the answer to a very important question, you'll know that you can trace the causality of how let's say the tarot cards, how the card comes to you, how the card came into being can certainly be traced back. How you came to be holding the deck of cards in your hand can be traced as well. What can't be traced is that meaningfulness that happens when the single card is turned over, or when you lay out a spread of cards, or when you cast the coins of the I Ching. That is that mysterious and oftentimes life-changing occurrence that can happen in a synchronicity. So I think I'm going to stop there. Again, I know I'm just a tiny bit over because I'd like to bring in some other voices, the voices of our panelists. If you all would come back on with your microphones and your cameras. The question that we posed to our panelists today was whether they could trace any synchronicities in their own lives, and how are they seeing synchronicities play out in our communal life now? Are they seeing evidence of synchronicities in the world? Would any of you like to begin? Just jump right in.
I'll go first and just discuss my personal path to Pacifica in terms of synchronicity. I was in graduate school in New York, studying psychology in a Freudian based program. But I was always spiritually minded, was getting to the end of the master's program and really struggling with what I wanted to do next, because the clinical programs which I was heading towards were all Freudian or broadly secular, in the sense of not incorporating things like that are being discussed today. And so I got to a bit of an impasse where I decided I was not going to proceed with clinical psychology, and applied to a Master of Fine Arts program on the East Coast in Washington, D.C. Part of this story is I was dedicated to the East Coast at this point in my life, and I had explored other options that incorporated spirituality into clinical work and things like that. And Pacifica had popped up, and I think at some random point, months before, I must have put in my information at Pacifica for a catalog. So that was happening, and I'd done that, left it, forgot it, because I was decidedly against moving to California or wanting to get out of New York in any way. But in the process of applying to the Master of Fine Arts program, I sent an application, and a few weeks went by, a month went by, 2 months went by, and I started getting very, very nervous. Like, well, I'd never experienced that much a delay, and I would call them and say, did I get rejected? What's the process where I'm at? And they'd be like, no, everything's fine. It's just taking a long time. As those weeks went on, my sort of planned concept of where I had decided things were going to go with my life had loosened up again. The anxiety of waiting had opened me up to maybe this isn't all there is that I can think about. About the end of month 2, a Pacifica catalog showed up in the mail, and landed at the exact moment where I was like, I'm open to anything. If something shows up that's better than the path I've decided upon. I opened it up, I read it again, and for the first time it really hit me. Pacifica is that's where these worlds come together. And I think it was a couple of weeks before the deadline. I sent in everything in about a week, heard back a week later, got accepted. I'm guessing it was 2 or 3 days after that I got the acceptance letter from the Master of Fine Arts program. But by then, like, my entire world had shifted, and that invitation from Pacifica, that catalog that I experienced as an invitation at that moment, opened my entire world. I came to Pacifica, was the most transformative, intimate, difficult experience and rewarding experience of my life. And that was the story that brought me here.
It's fantastic, Dylan. I've heard many of those very similar stories when I speak to students and alums. So I want to turn now to Tara.
Hi. So I want to be mindful of the time, but I was trying to answer some of the questions, and I went back to Jung's Collected Works, Volume 8, The Synchronicity, his book. And he talks about that the images of wholeness are spontaneously being produced, and that they generally appear in times of psychic disorientation in order to compensate a chaotic sense and help us formulate with numinous experiences. And I mention that because the synchronistic things that came to mind to share today are not necessarily ones that are always wonderful, although synchronicity did also bring me to Pacifica in a wonderfully surprising way. But my personal experience that really allowed me to open up and transform was a recognition that I was experiencing pain and accidents in synchronous ways that eventually drove me away from what I had been doing and to open up and to consider something else. And I'm such a stubborn and determined person that it took quite a lot of pain. I was eventually in a car accident where I couldn't move and I couldn't walk for about 7 months. And that really gave me time to think about what I should be doing and what was calling. And it began the shift that eventually did lead me to Pacifica. And then one of the other questions was about how we see it in the world now. And with this massive shift of the epidemic this year, my work has gone online. And as I mentioned before, I work a lot with attachment, and I've seen, oddly enough, Zoom itself does some of the synchronicity of people that have attachment difficulties. We end up spending a lot of the time going back into the very basics of, can you find me? Yes, I will find you, right? And Zoom and the synchronous acausal principles seem to know which people need that. And it continues until they feel found, and then the medium will hold. And I find that such an amazing piece, that it doesn't happen with all of my clients. It just happens with the ones that need to earn that part of their attachment strategy. And so I think I live in synchronicity, and I'm so thankful for it. It's so much more intelligent than I am. And with that, I think I'm good.
Good way to put it. Absolutely. Devin, how about you?
Sure. I mean, I can definitely look back on the encounters that brought me to Pacifica, but the bigger example that I have is really what set me into my dissertation topic. So I was trying to decide, I knew I wanted to write about aesthetic experience, which is in a way a lot of the same thing we're talking about with synchronicity, being very affected and arrested by something spontaneous and strange, and how that can change the course of our life and our being. But I also felt really pulled toward the Dionysian and wanting to follow that. So anyway, long story short, as I was, I think, writing my concept paper, I had just an image come to mind. It started that way, where I kind of saw this spontaneous image in my imagination of the figure of Dionysus approaching this illuminated hut in the woods, where a quiet woman was sitting in front of a fire. And I knew that he had come to enter her domain, and that she had been expecting him. And there was a real intensity but friendliness about it. And so I kind of knew that seemed to be a figure like Hestia. And then either the same day or within the same week, I was doing some research and came across a passage about this kind of rare element of the Dionysian mythology, which is that he did in fact sort of take Hestia's seat on Olympus, and that they have this very little written about but important connection. And so it started with a psychic image, and then the synchronicity came with reading this passage about that they did have a connection I had never known about. So that kind of affirmed to me going in that direction, and that the ecstatic and the everyday have a important bond to explore, and sacred profane. It's sort of at the same heart of the idea of synchronicity, this joining. So that was enough to make me sure of following that, and that work has carried me forward ever since. In terms of looking at culture more largely, I was thinking about the digital age we're increasingly in, and the increase of media that we swim in, and how that does give an extra layer of imagery to just for synchronistic experiences to happen with. And then I also appreciated you bringing up that, synchronicity is not necessarily, it's not a moral principle. It's neither good nor bad. And I think that's an important thing to consider lately, because a sort of shadowy side in the synchronicity family is the principle of confirmation bias. And I think we see a lot of that being talked about in our very divided, ideologically divided country. So I was thinking about that a bit leading up to this, and these are kind of raw thoughts, but I thought that an important differentiation is that confirmation bias is a kind of self-enclosing phenomenon. But synchronicity in Jung's sense is really something that's self-opening and a connective principle.
Good way to put it.
Yeah, thanks. And
Thanks
that,
for coming in. If
oh,
you don't
just,
want to go to gallery, it's where
yeah.
our time for everyone. Thank you so
Oh
much.
yeah, sorry, I got carried away.
Gallery.
Yeah, here's something interesting. Just before Devin started talking, I wrote down that the pandemic is forcing us inward into our own interiority, where we're first forced to worship Hestia. Like almost seconds before she started talking.
That's so strange.
Yeah, so there, you know, it's, yeah, I think just as Dr. Wood spoke about it, the myth of meaning was so primary for Jung, and whether you have meaning or don't have meaning kind of determined a lot. And Jung wrote that a psychoneurosis must be understood ultimately as the suffering of a soul which has not discovered its meaning. So I think synchronicities point us in the direction of meaning and seem to embody the imperatives of the archetype of fate. And in my own personal experience, I think it was like almost 5 years ago when I was sitting in Barrett Center and I was attending Pacifica Day, much like we are today. And there was a panelist on stage and she was talking about how she went through the Engaged Humanities program and that she was at that moment in the process of finishing up the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program. And I was sitting in the audience and I instantly knew like that. I just knew that I was going to do exactly what she had done. I was still unsure about attending Pacifica. And as I was driving back home, I was kind of thinking about it and driving back to LA. And I just happened to look to my left and I saw this building. It said Thousand Oaks Civic Center. And, you know, whatever, I just kept on driving. And at the time I used to watch Gilmar a lot. And this was a Saturday. Pacifica Days are usually on a Saturday. And so I went, oh, was it a Friday? I can't remember. Either way, I went home and I watched the program. And he does this thing at the end called New Rules. And one of them was all about the Thousand Oaks Civic Center. And I was just like, what? Like just hours earlier, I'd happened to see it. I'd never seen it before in my life. There were two other big synchronicities that happened within like 48 hours. So there's like three really big back-to-back synchronicity events. And at that point, I thought, okay, I just feel like this is telling me to definitely go to this school. So at that point, I just filled out the application and there were a lot of logistics, but, and now I'm the panelist telling you that I'm finishing the Jungian Archetypal Studies program. And I'm actually taking the synchronicity class right now. And Dr. Wood asked me to be one of the panelists and she had no idea that I'm actually in the synchronicity class right now. So it all just coming together really in a wonderful way. And I would say that if you're in search of meaning in your life, this is the place where you're going to find it.
Thank you, Gallery. Beautiful. Thank all of you so much for being here with us this morning, for pondering these deep questions. For those of you attending, this is kind of what a class is like. We toss out some ideas and we all bring something in. We all amplify this together. I'm taking notes, listening to all of you. It's just really wonderful new pathways. So I need to turn things back over to Jessica now because we are very cognizant of people's schedules. So Jessica, back to you. I think you're still muted, Jessica.
Yes, thank you. So we still have about 10 minutes left. So we do have a few questions. Just to note, one of the questions was about scholarships. And if you're interested to learn more about that, we do have a student services panel where financial aid will be joining us. So that's a great place to learn more about scholarships.
As Jessica is surveying the questions, I'll show you all. This is Joseph Cambray, our president's book on synchronicity. And I'm planning to put together a book list. Here's Jung's synchronicity that Tara talked about, and I've got another stack of 4 or 5 here. So I'll make that list available to the admissions advisors for any of you attending today who want to go a bit more deeply into this. Start with Dr. Cambray's book and then go from there. Jessica?
Great. So one of the questions is, what role do you see synchronicity playing in therapy, either from your own experience, working as a therapist, or undergoing therapy yourself?
That's for Tara, who's our therapist.
I think synchronicity is sort of it's the bread and butter of depth work. People bring together things, and the process of looking for the meaning means that they start noticing what's happening, what are the patterns, what's repeating, and that allows us to integrate things into consciousness, that allows us to shift the repetitions that we don't like, that aren't affirming for us, that are a problem, and to step into the ones that are bringing us the meaning that fulfills our purpose and helps us have deep connection. And I think that it comes up in lots of different ways. I was listening to a therapist earlier this week who was talking about one of his patients who was struggling with his mother complex and was screaming, "I'm powerless, I'm powerless, I'm powerless." And the power went out in their building. and they worked with it, and after doing an interpretation, the patient was like, "I'm powerful? I'm powerful? Really? I'm powerful?" And the lights came back on. And it's that kind of thing that allows a complete transformation moment that's far bigger than anything one person can do. It's part of, it feels like the collective is working together.
Great, thank you for that. We have another question. Somebody would like you to speak more about the idea that the universe is permeated in consciousness and what that means.
Who wants to take that one? Dylan.
From a depth psychological perspective, and Dr. Cambray spoke to this, is there's an idea of a psychoid dimension of the psyche, which means it's the connecting point where inner and outer worlds are inseparable. And so that is really what in depth psychological terms means that psyche and world are sort of the inside and outside of the same thing. And so that's why the mission of Pacifica is tending to soul in and of the world, because what's going on inside of us, what is going on culturally, is all psyche, and the world itself is the other side of psychic experience. And so it is this whole. The phrase universe is permeated in consciousness wouldn't necessarily be a Jungian expression, but we have our way of saying that inner and outer are two sides of the same coin.
Thank you. Another question, somebody wants to know, does one need to recognize the synchronicity as it happens? If you find it looking backward, would it be confirmation bias? How do you know if it's confirmation bias or synchronicity?
Why don't you take that, Devin?
Yeah, since I brought it, up. I think it can be a subtle difference. It's hard to know for certain. And I don't think that, I think a sense of affirmation isn't necessarily a negative thing, but that when we're struck with one of these meaningful psychoid events, that it's a call to attention. It might not be a call to follow, but maybe like follow up with, and I don't know, I definitely have synchronistic experiences that aren't simultaneous. They are sort of, looking back, you can see that these things are kind of connected, and time is not linear in this sense. So something I thought of was that maybe this is helpful to determining the difference, maybe not, but it seems like a synchronistic experience, in the sense that we're talking about it, indicates a path, and a confirmation bias sort of indicates it affirms a privilege more than, or a prejudice, really. It confirms something that's more about prejudice in your life than an openness to path and connectedness. I don't know. Something along those lines.
Can I jump in just real quick?
Mhm.
Normally a synchronicity is surprising to us. And so confirmation bias tends to confirm what we already know, where synchronicity often disrupts what our perspective.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
May I add just a little bit?
Yes.
I think that synchronicities sometimes repeat when we are in a forgetting pattern, and they get sort of louder and bigger. This is one of the things clinically I work with, is looking backwards. Often people suddenly realize there's been this pattern, but they didn't take it in until it got really big and really loud in their life. And so I think that's part of it. Does happen over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Tara's comment links us to one of the other great thinkers that Pacifica is founded upon, James Hillman, with his thoughts, his acorn theory, and the call of the daimon, the inner genius, the inner image that reminds us in many ways, a gentle push or a shove sometimes that can feel like a synchronistic event, to pay attention.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all our panelists.